The story of Ohrdruf begins not with barbed wire or the crack of boots, but with a silence so heavy that it seems to settle over the land like a shroud. The hills of Thuringia had seen centuries of human footsteps, but none prepared them for the weight of what would be built there in 1944. Even now the earth seems to remember. There is a stillness that does not feel peaceful but drained, as though the ground itself has been hollowed out by what occurred. Ohrdruf was not designed to leave survivors. It was not meant to be a camp of life, but a place where human beings were stripped, emptied, used and discarded. It was a labor engine powered by exhaustion and fear, a place where the value of a man was measured only in whether he could pick up a shovel one more time. Those who limped, faltered or slowed became reminders to others of what waited at the edge of collapse. Soldiers who had stared death in the face on foreign battlefields were stunned into disbelief when they crossed its threshold. It was here that their understanding of cruelty changed forever, for the camp radiated a coldness that was not just physical, it was systemic, deliberate and utterly unrelenting. From the beginning, the prisoners dragged into Ohrdruf sensed that it was different from the camps they had come through before. Many had already endured the suffocating terror of transport trains, the dehumanizing routines of larger camps, the endless roll calls that blurred days into nights. But Ohrdruf felt stripped of even the thin pretense of order they had known elsewhere. Here there was no ideology repeated by guards to justify their actions, no propaganda posters, no orchestrated ceremonies of cruelty. At Ohrdruf, brutality was not theatrical. It was mechanical. It was a place where the machinery of forced labor operated without hesitation, where prisoners were pushed toward a breaking point not as a spectacle, but as a routine. They were not meant to be terrorized for ideological indoctrination. They were meant to be exploited until their bodies could no longer function, and then they were meant to disappear. This quiet absence of symbolic violence made the cruelty feel colder, as if the camp had stripped even hatred from its operations, leaving behind only a sterile calculation of human endurance. The men who arrived here came from many places: France, Poland, Hungary, the Soviet Union, Germany itself. Some were political prisoners, torn from resistance networks or underground circles. Others were captured soldiers, starved and weakened long before they reached the camp. Many were Jews transferred from other camps, half-starved ghosts forced onward to fuel another project of a dying regime. Regardless of their origins, they converged at Ohrdruf under the same bleak sky, marched into the camp under guard dogs and rifles, and felt the same suffocating realization settle upon them. Whatever thin thread of humanity had existed in earlier camps had frayed away here. Ohrdruf was something more stripped down, more merciless, more narrowly focused. It did not pretend to be a community of prisoners. It was a work site carved into earth and stone, a place where men were reduced to shovels with beating hearts. By late 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing. With it came desperation, and desperation built camps like Ohrdruf. The surrounding hills were blasted open to create underground facilities designed to withstand Allied air raids. Prisoners were marched out before dawn into the freezing wind and shoved into tunnels where dust filled their lungs and tools scraped against stone until their hands bled. There were no safety precautions, no proper ventilation, no concern for survival. Men collapsed where they stood, the stale air thickening until every breath felt like swallowing grit. The work consumed bodies in a predictable rhythm: numbness, exhaustion, unconsciousness. Recovery was neither expected nor encouraged. Those who fainted were dragged aside. Those who stood too slowly after falling felt blows landing across their backs like punctuation marks to remind them that existence in Ohrdruf depended entirely on movement, constant, unbroken movement. In the barracks, the air hung heavy with the smell of damp wood, sweat, and sickness. The bunks were stacked tight, bodies packed together not for comfort, but because there was no space to separate suffering. The thin blankets provided barely a whisper of insulation against the winter cold. Nights stretched endlessly, broken by coughing fits, whispered prayers, or the quiet muttering of men trying to cling to their sanity. Some prisoners tried to recall memories from before: family dinners, warm summers, the sound of children playing. But the images flickered weakly, like lanterns struggling against a storm. Hunger hollowed them out. It wasn't simply the physical emptiness of an unfed stomach. It was the mental erosion that hunger brings, the way it dulls thought and narrows the world into a single point of need that can never be satisfied. Even the strongest among them began to lose their orientation, forgetting days, losing track of weeks, sinking into a fog of perpetual weakness. Dawn did not bring the promise of a new day. It brought the certainty of another shift of labour that felt indistinguishable from the one before it. The guards called their names, or rather their numbers, with an indifference so complete it was almost chilling. To the SS, the men were units of labour. To the prisoners, the guards were moving shadows of authority, unpredictable but always present. A glance too slow, a movement too hesitant, these tiny missteps could transform into punishment with terrifying speed, and so the prisoners tried to maintain whatever rhythm of compliance their failing bodies could still manage. If you're finding this documentary informative so far and want more deep historical content, please take a moment to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. It helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more long-form documentaries. Rumours drifted through the camp like fragments of wind. Some whispered that the underground tunnels they were carving were meant to house factories or military headquarters. Others believed they were building shelters for Nazi leaders. No one truly knew, and the guards offered no clarity. But in the end, the purpose hardly mattered. What mattered was the toll, the daily erosion of bodies and minds. The tunnels consumed men as surely as any battlefield. The difference was that here there was no enemy to fight, no strategies to learn, no weapon to wield. Only the unyielding earth and the cold commands of overseers. Roll calls served as reminders that humanity had been replaced by order. Prisoners were lined up in rigid formations, forced to stand for hours regardless of weather. The icy wind cut through their thin uniforms like knives. Some men wavered, knees trembling, bodies swaying dangerously. If they fell, they were dragged upright or left where they collapsed, depending on the guard's mood. These roll calls were not merely administrative routines. They were tests of will designed to break the last reserves of strength inside each man. It was in these moments that hope flickered like a dying ember. Some men whispered to each other to hold on, to stand straight, to breathe slowly. Others let their thoughts drift away, numbing themselves to the reality in front of them. For the few who attempted to maintain a sense of solidarity, moments of connection felt like stolen treasures. A shared crust of bread, a quiet word of encouragement, a whispered prayer. These were the things that tethered some to life. But even these tiny acts of humanity were overshadowed by the relentless pressure of the camp's brutality. The prisoners were not only physically weakened, but spiritually drained. Many felt themselves slipping away, not through dramatic gestures, but through a quiet surrender, the kind that happens when suffering becomes too constant to resist. As the winter deepened and the Reich crumbled further, the conditions in Ohrdruf grew even worse. Supplies dwindled. Guards became harsher. The atmosphere of desperation thickened like heavy fog. Men who had survived other camps with a spark of resistance found that spark faltering here. The camp offered no illusions, no distractions, no moments of reprieve. It was a pure distillation of a system that valued human life at zero. And somewhere beneath the earth, the tunnels continued to grow, carved by hands that trembled, cracked, and bled. Ohrdruf existed for a short span of time, yet every day stretched into a lifetime for those trapped within it. The chill of pre-dawn, the ache of labour, the suffocating darkness of the tunnels, the deadened eyes of the guards, all fused into a rhythm of existence that crushed hope with methodical precision. And although liberation would eventually come, it would not erase the feeling that this place had sunk its cold fingers into the souls of those who entered it, leaving marks that no light could fully dispel. As the new year of 1945 unfolded, Ohrdruf descended further into a realm where time lost its meaning and suffering became the only constant. The camp operated with an intensity that suggested the regime knew its time was running out. Orders cascaded down with increasing urgency, and every command carried the weight of a collapsing Reich desperate to squeeze the last ounce of labour from bodies that were no longer capable of endurance. Prisoners felt this shift instinctively. The guards grew sharper, more impatient, more unpredictable. They barked commands with a feverish edge, as though aware that the world beyond the camp's perimeter was drastically changing. Allied bombings shook the distant hills, and sometimes faint vibrations trembled through the ground beneath prisoners' feet. But inside Ohrdruf, these distant thunderclaps brought no relief. If anything, they intensified the pressure, as overseers pushed the men to work even harder, determined to complete as much as possible before the inevitable collapse. The camp's routines hardened into something that resembled ritual cruelty. The mornings felt colder, the marches longer, the work heavier. Exhaustion settled onto prisoners like a permanent weight, dragging down their steps and clouding their minds. The simplest tasks, lifting a tool, stepping onto frozen ground, swallowing a mouthful of thin soup, felt monumental. Some men began to move through the camp in a daze, eyes unfocused, gestures automatic. They were still alive in the physical sense, but inside something had dimmed. Hope had been replaced by a dull, resigned persistence. Life became a matter of continuing until the body could no longer comply. In the tunnels, the air thickened with dust and dampness. The sounds of picks and shovels echoed endlessly, merging into an oppressive drone that seemed to vibrate through the prisoners' bones. The lights inside the tunnels flickered, casting long shadows that gave everything an eerie, unreal feel. Men worked in semi-darkness, their breaths shallow, their muscles trembling from strain. Every moment threatened collapse. Those who stumbled were shoved back into line or pushed aside to recover, if recovery was even possible. A few tried to steady themselves by imagining the world outside the tunnels: forests, sunlight, families, warm meals. But those images seemed increasingly distant, like fading dreams remembered only in fragments. Occasionally, a prisoner whispered that liberation might be near. Rumours drifted in with new arrivals or guards' careless conversations. But hope was dangerous in this place. The possibility of rescue felt almost too heavy to bear, like a flame that could burn instead of warm. Many prisoners chose not to listen, refusing to let their thoughts rise above the reality in front of them. They had been disappointed too many times. They had witnessed too many moments where expectations dissolved into despair. Better to keep eyes down, arms moving, feet shuffling forward. Better to survive the next minute, then the next hour, then the next day, if survival was still within reach. Roll calls grew even more punishing during these final months. Men were forced to stand in snow or mud for unimaginable lengths of time, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from cold and fatigue. The guards' impatience showed through in every command, every gesture. They paced back and forth, checking the lines with harsh stares. For the prisoners, each roll call felt like a test, designed not just to count them, but to drain whatever strength remained. The wind whipped across the open yard, biting into exposed skin. Some prisoners wrapped their arms around themselves in a feeble attempt to retain warmth. Others remained rigid, knowing that any sign of weakness could draw attention. The collective silence during these moments felt heavier than the physical suffering. It was the silence of men who had learned that their voices no longer mattered. The barracks offered no comfort at the end of the day. The wooden walls absorbed the cold instead of blocking it. The air inside was thick with the breath of dozens of exhausted men. At night, some prisoners tried to huddle closer to share warmth, though there was never enough strength among them to make the effort meaningful. Conversation was rare. Words felt too precious to waste, and talking required an energy that few possessed. Yet even in this bleak atmosphere, small moments of humanity persisted. A man adjusting the blanket over a neighbour's shoulders, another sharing a memory of home to distract someone from despair, a whispered promise that they would try to survive one more day. These gestures were brief and fragile, but they flickered through the darkness like sparks that refused to be extinguished completely. Disease travelled through the barracks with alarming speed. The cold weakened immune systems, and the cramped conditions accelerated transmission. Prisoners coughed into their hands, tried to suppress sneezes, fought fevers that left them shivering uncontrollably. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Those who grew too ill to work were often treated as burdens, left in their bunks, ignored during roll call, or carried out when they became too weak to move. The boundaries between sickness and exhaustion blurred. Many men did not know whether their symptoms came from illness or simply the toll of starvation and overwork. Their bodies felt foreign, unreliable, as though they no longer belonged to them. By February, the atmosphere in the camp had changed again. Guards moved with an uneasy tension, speaking in short, clipped phrases. They seemed more alert to distant explosions, more aggressive during inspections. Prisoners sensed that something was shifting, though they had no clear information. The war outside the camp's fences was accelerating, pushing closer to the heart of Germany. But inside Ohrdruf, time continued at its slow, painful pace. The prisoners' world remained confined to barracks, tunnels, roll calls, and the unending rhythm of survival. They could feel the pressure tightening around them, yet they had no way to interpret it. The underground project intensified. New equipment arrived and work hours stretched even longer. The tunnels sprawled into a labyrinth of half-finished chambers and dead ends. Engineers barked orders while guards enforced them with ruthless efficiency. Prisoners struggled to keep pace, but their bodies rebelled more often now. Fainting became common. Men slumped against walls, gasping for air, hands trembling uncontrollably. The guards responded with cold practicality. Prisoners were forced back to their feet, shaken awake, or shoved forward. There was no attempt to hide the disregard for human life. The priorities of the camp were clear. The work mattered. The workers did not. Some prisoners tried to keep track of time by scratching marks into wood or whispering dates to one another. But the days blended together with a monotony so oppressive that even the concept of a calendar felt absurd. They lived in a space where seasons had meaning that was only physical, cold in winter, mud in spring, but no emotional significance. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries were swallowed by the camp's all-consuming routines. The future shrank into the smallest conceivable unit of time. The next breath, the next step, the next command. At night, some prisoners dreamed of escape, though deep down they knew escape from Ohrdruf was nearly impossible. The surrounding terrain, the constant supervision, the weakened state of their bodies, all formed barriers too great to overcome. Still, the mind attempted to survive in its own way. Some imagined running through forests, others pictured Allied planes overhead, dropping supplies or soldiers. But in the morning, the cold reality of the camp extinguished these fragile fantasies. And yet, even as despair deepened, a tiny thread of resistance remained, not in the form of rebellion or sabotage, but in the quiet decision to continue existing. Every breath taken against the camp's intent was a form of defiance. Every shared glance between prisoners, every moment in which they refused to surrender to hopelessness, was a victory the guards never saw. The men of Ohrdruf had been stripped of almost everything, but they continued to live, if only because their bodies had not yet given out. In this place, the act of enduring was revolutionary. As March approached, the distant rumble of artillery grew more distinct. The camp's guards stiffened at every sound. Prisoners, though starved of information, sensed that something monumental was nearing. But whether that meant liberation or increased brutality, they could not know. The world outside Ohrdruf was changing rapidly, but the prisoners were trapped in a pocket of suffering that felt suspended between time and eternity, waiting for a shift that could either save them or consume them entirely. By the time March reached its midpoint, Ohrdruf existed in a strange tension, a tightening coil of desperation and inevitability. The guards sensed the approaching collapse of the front lines, but instead of easing their grip, they clamped down harder. The prisoners felt the change as an almost physical force pressing down upon them. The camp pulsed with a frantic urgency, as though its routines were being accelerated toward a final breaking point. Work details were driven more brutally, hours stretched deeper into the night, and the slightest hesitation could provoke an eruption of violence from overseers who feared losing control. It was as if the camp itself had become aware of its own impending end and was determined to wring out every last drop of labour from the men trapped within its boundaries before history overtook it. Within the tunnels, the air hung heavier than before. The growing warmth of early spring caused moisture to cling to the walls, turning the ground slick and making each step treacherous. The mixture of sweat, dust, and dampness created a suffocating haze that blurred vision and clogged lungs. The rhythm of picks striking stone became a dull, constant heartbeat echoing through cramped passageways. Prisoners felt themselves dissolving into the endless monotony of movement. Lift, swing, dig, breathe, cough, repeat. The repetition was so consuming that some men forgot their own names for moments at a time, remembering only their position in the line, their next movement, the weight of the tool in their trembling hands. The guards walked through the tunnels with quick, agitated steps. Their boots splashed through the mud, their shadows cast long and distorted by flickering lamps. They pretended authority, but beneath the harsh commands, the prisoners could sense fear. The guards, too, were trapped, though in a different way. They were caught between loyalty to a collapsing regime and the dread of what awaited them if captured. This tension spilled into their behaviour, sharpening their tempers, amplifying their cruelty. A cough, a stumble, a momentary slump of the shoulders could bring sudden punishment. The prisoners tried to appear steady even when their bodies shook violently from exhaustion. Outside the tunnels, the landscape mirrored the camp's shifting mood. Snow had begun to melt, forming rivulets of muddy water that pooled between buildings. The sky often hung low with clouds, casting dull light over the compound. In rare moments of sunlight, the camp looked even more bleak, its fences, barracks, and watchtowers stark against the brightness, like scars illuminated rather than hidden. Prisoners marching to and from work felt the sunlight as something foreign, almost intrusive, as though the natural world had not intended to shine upon a place so devoid of humanity. Inside the barracks, men whispered nervously about the sounds they heard at night. Sometimes the distant thunder of artillery echoed faintly through the hills. Other times, low rumbling vibrations spread through the earth, so subtle that prisoners questioned whether they were real or imagined. Rumours gathered strength with each passing day. The Americans were close. The front was collapsing. The war was nearly over. But hopes in Ohrdruf were fragile things, easily damaged by reality. Some prisoners, too weakened by disappointment, refused to believe. Others clung to the rumours like life rafts, repeating them under their breath as though speaking them aloud might somehow bring liberation faster. The roll calls grew even more excruciating. The thinning ranks of prisoners made the empty spaces between them feel like ghosts, silent reminders of men who had collapsed, vanished, or died in the night. Guards stalked along the rows with renewed hostility, their eyes scanning for the slightest imperfection. Prisoners fought to remain upright, locking their knees, tightening their muscles, clenching their teeth. Some whispered encouragement to each other, though their voices were barely audible over the wind. Standing for hours in damp clothing, feet sinking slowly into thawing mud, they felt their bodies begging for rest that never came. Even the simplest acts became monumental challenges. Lifting a spoon required gathering strength. Sitting up in bed demanded focus. Walking from a bunk to the door felt like a journey. The barracks smelled of damp wood, sweat, illness, and the constant presence of too many bodies in too small a space. Symptoms of starvation became the norm: shaking hands, hollow eyes, swollen joints, splitting skin. The prisoners knew these signs intimately. They had seen them in one another long enough to understand that these were not temporary discomforts, but the steady erasure of human life. Still, some quiet acts of resistance continued. A man would share his last piece of bread with someone weaker. Another would whisper a joke to coax a faint smile from a friend. Someone might hum a melody from childhood, barely audible, but enough to remind a few listeners that life had once been larger. These fragments of humanity were small, almost invisible to the casual observer, but to the prisoners they were the last threads connecting them to the world outside the camp. They represented something the camp had not succeeded in destroying: the capacity to care, even in a place designed to extinguish all compassion. The guards, increasingly unsettled, made mistakes in their attempts to maintain control. They argued with each other more frequently. Their formations during inspections appeared less disciplined. Some avoided eye contact with the prisoners, as though uncomfortable with the reality that the end was near. Others became more aggressive, perhaps fearing that any sign of weakness would be judged harshly by their superiors. The camp's command structure strained under the pressure of the advancing Allied forces, and these fractures were felt throughout Ohrdruf like tremors before an earthquake. The underground construction project, once considered vital, now seemed fueled not by strategy, but by desperation. Prisoners were forced to carve deeper, expand further, even as the tunnels became increasingly unstable. Sometimes the walls groaned under pressure, and faint cracking sounds raised the hairs on the prisoners' necks. They worked with an unspoken awareness that they were laboring inside a fragile, crumbling structure that could bury them at any moment. But there was no alternative. Fear of collapse was outweighed by fear of the guards. Day after day the routine continued: awakened before dawn, counted endlessly, forced to march, pushed to work, marched back, counted again, and then confined to barracks where the night offered little rest. Sleep came in fragments, disturbed by coughing, nightmares, and the ever-present cold. The prisoners had long since forgotten what it felt like to lie down without pain, or to wake without dread. Even in their dreams, they were still in the camp, still digging, still hearing commands echo through the tunnels. The camp had seeped into their minds so deeply that it became inseparable from their identities. In late March, the guards' behavior shifted once more. They moved quickly, spoke urgently, and seemed troubled by orders arriving from above. Prisoners noticed that supplies were being moved hastily, documents carried or burned, equipment relocated. Something was happening behind the scenes, something that carried a charge of panic. The atmosphere thickened with tension, but the prisoners could do nothing except observe and survive. They exchanged glances, some hopeful, others fearful. Change in a place like Ohrdruf rarely meant safety. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the layers of suffering, a faint stirring began in the hearts of some prisoners. The feeling that the world outside was finally approaching, that the camp's silence was about to be broken. But that approaching moment carried its own risks, its own unknowns. Liberation was not guaranteed. Even if the front drew closer, the guards might choose evacuation, or worse. And so the prisoners waited, not with anticipation, but with the heavy resignation of men who have been taught that fate is indifferent to their suffering. The final days of March passed with a strange, uneasy pace. Work continued, but the tension was unmistakable. Guards barked orders with urgency. Prisoners stumbled through tasks without knowing whether they were preparing for another day of labor or the camp's final act. The tunnels echoed with sounds that felt different, more hurried, more chaotic. The prisoners sensed that a storm was building, and they could only brace themselves for whatever came next. What lay ahead would bring the darkest hours of Ohrdruf's existence, when the camp's machinery of cruelty began to unravel even as it continued to grind forward. The end was approaching, but endings in places like this were rarely merciful. As April crept toward Ohrdruf like a gathering storm, the atmosphere in the camp grew almost unbearable, not because the routines changed, but because something intangible, something heavy and electric, settled over every yard, every barrack, every tunnel. Prisoners felt it before they understood it. The guards walked differently, with short, abrupt movements, eyes darting toward the horizon as though listening for a sound they could not quite hear. Orders came more rapidly, delivered with a tone that betrayed a tightening grip on authority slipping through trembling fingers. Men who had once moved with rigid certainty now carried a nervous tension that seeped into the air around them. This change, subtle at first, grew more pronounced with each passing day, and the prisoners sensed that the camp stood on the edge of something immense. Yet even as the world outside inched closer, the camp's internal machinery did not loosen. In fact, the routines sharpened, as though the camp was determined to extract every remaining fragment of strength from the men before whatever lay ahead arrived. Work details were driven out earlier, marched back later, pushed harder. The tunnels, which had already claimed so much life and energy, became sites of near-manic effort. Tools clanged against rock with frantic speed, not because prisoners had found new reserves of strength, but because guards hovered nearby, barking commands with a desperation that felt almost wild. The prisoners did not need to be told that the project was behind schedule. They could feel it in the air, sense it in the hurried gestures of engineers and overseers. Every action carried the weight of impending collapse. Inside the tunnels, the conditions deteriorated further. The melting ground above caused water to seep through cracks and drip constantly, forming puddles that reflected the flickering lights and gave the place a haunting, distorted quality. The mix of dampness and dust created a choking fog that hung low over the ground. The lamps, unreliable at the best of times, flickered more frequently, sometimes plunging the workers into brief pockets of darkness that stretched long enough for panic to slither into their chests. In those moments the prisoners froze, their breaths sharp and shallow, imagining the tunnel collapsing, imagining the earth swallowing them whole. When the lights returned, they resumed their labor with trembling hands, grateful only that the ground still held. The guards' voices echoed strangely inside the tunnels, bouncing off the uneven walls, distorted into sounds that felt less like orders and more like the growls of an approaching beast. Prisoners learned to recognize the tone rather than the words. Sharp meant hurry, low meant danger, shouting meant punishment. The language of the camp had become instinctual. Men reacted before their minds processed what they heard, their bodies conditioned by months of survival to respond immediately. Yet beneath these conditioned reactions lay something new, a nervous, flickering awareness that the guards themselves were unraveling. Their authority, once a monolith, now appeared cracked at the edges. Outside, the roll calls became a theatre of fear. Guards paced furiously, counting and recounting the prisoners as though expecting them to evaporate. The prisoners stood in their rows, swaying slightly in the early morning wind, their faces gaunt, their eyes darkened by exhaustion and dread. The ground beneath their feet, softened by spring thaw, pulled at their boots like quicksand. They tried to distribute their weight carefully, afraid that a misstep might cause them to fall and be unable to rise again. Falling in Ohrdruf always carried consequences. The guards, tense and jumpy, reacted to even the smallest deviation with disproportionate intensity. The barracks grew colder as April approached, despite the season's natural warmth. Not physically, the weather was softening, but emotionally. The men inside felt something close to suffocation, a pressure that seemed to press down from the ceiling, seep through the walls, coil around their chests. Sleep became even more fragmented as guards burst into the barracks at odd hours, checking for signs of illness, checking for escape attempts, checking for reasons to prove they still held control. Prisoners lay awake long after the guards left, staring into the darkness, listening to the shallow breathing of those beside them, wondering whether they would live long enough to understand the reason for the guards' agitation. Whispers multiplied in the barracks. Men speculated about the future, uncharacteristically, since hope had long been a luxury they avoided. Some believed the camp would be evacuated. Others feared executions. A few dared to suggest liberation was near. But none of these possibilities offered comfort, because all came wrapped in uncertainty and danger. The prisoners had learned that in places like Ohrdruf, the end of something terrible could be more terrifying than its continuation. Ends brought chaos. Chaos brought death. In the final days of March, a new pattern emerged. Guards began forcing prisoners to dig trenches just beyond the camp's boundaries. The purpose was not explained. The prisoners dug mechanically, their minds clouded by fatigue and fear, but they could not ignore the chill of dread creeping through their thoughts. Trenches might be for defences or latrines or storage, but they might also be for graves. The ambiguity was crueler than clarity would have been. It allowed imaginations to run wild, each possibility darker than the last. Inside the camp, prisoners witnessed small but telling details that confirmed their fears. Documents burned behind administrative buildings. Supplies that had been forgotten for months were suddenly moved. Tools were cleaned or hidden. Guards whispered to each other urgently, glancing around as though fearful of being overheard. Even the dogs sensed the tension, pacing restlessly, ears perked, growling at shadows they did not trust. Still, the camp ran as though nothing had changed. Work continued, roll calls dragged on, punishments persisted. The machinery of suffering did not pause simply because the war's tide had turned. The prisoners lived in a strange duality. The routines around them remained brutally consistent, but the ground beneath those routines trembled with uncertainty. They felt as though they were marching across thin ice, hearing it crack beneath their feet but unable to know when or where it would break. Some prisoners tried to prepare themselves mentally for the worst, rehearsing in their minds what they might do if the guards attempted a final act of desperation. But imagination offered little protection. Their bodies were too weak, their options too limited, their reality too controlled by forces far beyond their reach. They could barely stand upright during roll call. How could they resist or flee? The thought of fighting back felt almost absurd. Survival hinged on waiting, watching, enduring. Yet in the midst of this fear, a strange sense of awareness sharpened in the prisoners' minds. They noticed details they had never paid attention to before. The texture of the earth beneath the melting snow, the faint hint of greenery pushing through the mud, the irregular rhythm of distant explosions that seemed closer than before. These small signs, subtle but unmistakable, marked the beginning of something irreversible. The prisoners could not articulate what they were witnessing, but they sensed that the camp's life cycle had entered its final stage. As April drew nearer, the guards' fear transformed into something more dangerous: volatility. They yelled more often, struck out without warning, and acted with a chaotic energy that made every interaction unpredictable. Order in the camp still existed, but it was order maintained by trembling hands. The prisoners saw cracks forming everywhere, cracks in discipline, cracks in authority, cracks in the camp's very structure. The weight of these fractures pressed heavily on their spirits, but also stirred a faint, uneasy anticipation. The end was coming. Of that, they were certain. But what form that end would take remained shrouded in the same darkness that had covered their days for months. and so they continued their routines, marching, digging, standing, surviving, caught in the narrowing corridor of time that stretched between unbearable suffering and the unknown that awaited just beyond the camp's perimeter. Whether salvation or destruction approached, they had no way of knowing. They only understood that the camp's rhythm had changed in ways that carried the unmistakable scent of finality. In the opening days of April, the tension that had been building within Ohrdruf reached a threshold where it no longer felt like anticipation, but a suffocating certainty, a pressure that settled into the lungs of every prisoner and guard alike. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind, which usually cut sharply across the open ground, moved strangely, slower, heavier, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile balance that had emerged. The prisoners sensed that the camp had entered its last chapter, yet the manner in which that chapter would unfold remained concealed behind the opaque walls of fear and uncertainty. They moved through the days as though walking through a dream that teetered on the edge of becoming a nightmare, each step echoing with the knowledge that the world beyond the fences was no longer distant. The guards' nerves, stretched thin by weeks of dread, began to fray visibly. Their orders lost the sharp efficiency they once carried, replaced by hurried, ragged commands delivered in voices betraying tremors. Some guards avoided the prisoners' eyes entirely, afraid of what they might see reflected back at them, fear, hatred, or perhaps the simple awareness that their power was slipping. Others reacted violently, lashing out at the prisoners as though punishing them for the inevitability of the war's progression. Their dominance, once unquestioned, now felt brittle, as though a single unexpected moment could shatter it completely. The prisoners understood that this instability made the guards more dangerous than ever. Work assignments continued with escalating urgency. Prisoners were marched out earlier than usual, their weakened bodies struggling against the strain. The ground, softened by spring thaw, clung to their boots like heavy weights. As they reached the tunnels, they felt an eerie stillness around them, a sense that the earth itself was listening. Inside, the dim lamps flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows across the rough walls. The prisoners swung their tools mechanically, their movements sluggish but persistent. The guards stalked behind them, their boots crunching through debris, their attention divided between the labourers and the distant echoes of artillery that drifted through the hills. Every sound reverberated strangely in the tunnels, metal clanging on stone, strained breaths, the distant thud of collapsing earth, the muffled murmurs of guards conferring in urgent tones. At times the tunnels trembled faintly, causing particles of dust to fall like a grey snowfall onto the prisoners' shoulders. These tremors were never acknowledged by the guards, who barked at the men to continue working. But the prisoners felt each vibration as a reminder that the world outside was shifting rapidly, that the ground beneath their torment might soon break open to reveal something entirely different. On the surface, the camp buzzed with frantic activity. Documents were burned in metal barrels, the smoke rising in thin, dark plumes that curled into the sky like accusations. Equipment was moved, sorted, or dismantled. Some buildings were stripped of anything valuable. Guards ran errands with uncharacteristic haste. The prisoners watched these activities with hollow eyes, understanding only that the camp's infrastructure, once so permanent and oppressive, was dissolving. Yet dissolution did not equate to relief. A dying regime could be more violent in its final moments than in its years of strength. Rumours multiplied faster than ever. Some said the camp would be evacuated and that the prisoners would be forced onto long marches toward other camps farther from the front. Others whispered that the guards might attempt to erase evidence of the camp's existence in a final act of ruthless obedience. A few dared to believe that the Americans were close enough to liberate Ohrdruf within days, but every rumour carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Hope had always been treacherous here. It had the power to uplift and destroy in the same breath. The nights grew more restless. Guards patrolled outside the barracks with unusual frequency, their boots scraping repeatedly against the gravel. Prisoners lay awake listening to these sounds, their minds racing with possibilities. Some prayed silently, mouthing words they had not spoken in months. Others stared up at the dark ceiling, counting breaths to steady their nerves. The oldest prisoners, those who had survived multiple camps, recognized the signs. Chaos was coming. And chaos in the world of concentration camps could mean anything from sudden execution to abrupt abandonment. The unpredictability of these final days gnawed at their sanity. Inside the barracks, conversations were whispered in fragments, disjointed by fear and exhaustion. Men spoke of loved ones, wondering if they were still alive. Others recounted the faint memories of their homes, trying to hold on to pieces of their identity that had not been entirely consumed by the camp. Some spoke practically. If the evacuation came, who could walk? Who was too weak to carry themselves even a few steps? The prisoners understood that survival now hinged on forces far beyond human control. Their bodies, ravaged by months of deprivation, could only endure so much. And yet the will to live remained stubborn, even fierce in some of them. The smell of burned paper lingered throughout the camp, mixing with the dampness of early spring and the ever-present scent of illness. It clung to the prisoners' clothing, settled in their hair, seeped into the barracks. Every time they inhaled, the smoke reminded them that evidence was being erased, that the camp administration, in its desperation, was attempting to hide the truth of what had occurred here. This knowledge pressed heavily on the prisoners, though few dared to speak it aloud. They understood what the destruction of records often meant. The fear of being silenced forever loomed over them like an unspoken threat. The guards' conversations grew louder and more frantic as the days passed. The prisoners, though unable to understand every word, read the meaning in the guards' expressions. The furrowed brows, the restless pacing, the harsh whispers exchanged when they thought no one was listening. Tension twisted the air into something brittle. Prisoners braced themselves for commands that might pull them into tasks even more grueling or into situations far more dangerous. Each day felt suspended in a fragile balance, the weight of the unknown pressing down harder than the labor itself. By April 2nd, the distant sound of artillery was no longer distant. It rolled through the hills like approaching thunder, and even the guards could not pretend to ignore it. Their movements grew sharper, their tempers more fragile. They looked over their shoulders often, scanning the horizon with unease. Prisoners watched this shift with a mixture of fear and something faintly resembling anticipation, a feeling so fragile they dared not call it hope, but something adjacent to it, something that flickered deep within their hollowed chests. Still, the camp's routine continued. Prisoners labored in the tunnels. They stood for roll calls. They marched through mud. They endured the same hunger, the same exhaustion, the same relentless cycle of survival. The machinery of cruelty did not stop just because its operators sensed the end approaching. In fact, the camp's brutality seemed to intensify in these final days, as if it were determined to imprint itself onto the prisoners' memories so deeply that even liberation, should it come, would not erase its shadow. On April 3rd, the guards' panic reached a new threshold. Prisoners were abruptly ordered into new work details, some tasked with moving heavy crates whose contents were never explained, others forced to bury or burn materials that had once been considered essential. The pace of activity in the administrative buildings reached a frenzy. The prisoners felt this shift like a jolt, recognizing that whatever the guards feared was now imminent. The camp, which had always stood with sinister permanence, was unraveling before their eyes. And yet the prisoners remained trapped in the same relentless uncertainty. Liberation and destruction were both equally possible. They did not know which one was approaching. They only knew that Ohrdruf was trembling, its cruel order collapsing under the weight of events it could no longer withstand. The prisoners felt suspended between worlds, caught in a place where suffering had become routine, yet change hovered so close it brushed against their skin like an icy draught. Whatever came next would redefine their existence forever. But in these final days, before the storm reached the camp, they could only wait, endure, and brace themselves for an ending they could neither predict nor escape. On the morning of April 4th, 1945, the atmosphere inside Ohrdruf was unlike anything the prisoners had ever felt. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, humming with a frequency just below sound, as if the camp itself were bracing for something it could not comprehend. The guards moved with frantic energy, their commands sharp and disjointed, their eyes filled not with the cold arrogance that had once defined their authority, but with a raw, unmistakable fear. Prisoners were rushed through roll call at a pace entirely alien to the camp's usual routines, pushed into lines, then dispersed, then regrouped, all without explanation. Nothing made sense. Every movement seemed random, uncoordinated, desperate. It was the behavior of an institution cracking open under the pressure of its own collapse. By midday, the guards' panic reached its peak. They shouted conflicting orders, abandoned tasks halfway through, and barked at prisoners with a tone that no longer carried the confidence of power, but the tremor of uncertainty. Some guards fled abruptly, disappearing beyond the camp's perimeter without so much as a backward glance. Others remained but seemed frozen in indecision, torn between obedience to their superiors and the instinct to save themselves. The hierarchy that had once shaped every second of life in Ohrdruf dissolved in real time. Prisoners watched the disintegration with a mixture of disbelief and dread. They had never seen guards afraid, not truly afraid, and the sight unsettled them more deeply than any punishment ever had. The camp's routine unravelled further. Work details were suddenly cancelled. Prisoners were marched out of the tunnels only to be redirected aimlessly through the camp. Barracks were emptied, searched, then abandoned. A few guards attempted to restore order, shouting commands that echoed hollowly across the camp yard, but no one seemed to listen, not even the other guards. The prisoners, exhausted and disoriented, moved mechanically, uncertain whether compliance still mattered. They did not know whether they were being prepared for evacuation, punishment, or release. The uncertainty carved its way into their minds like a cold blade. Later in the afternoon, the guards who remained abruptly gathered into groups, clutching their rifles, glancing toward the hills beyond Ohrdruf. Their conversations, though hurried and quiet, revealed unmistakable fear. Some gestured wildly toward the horizon, others pointed toward the administrative buildings. A few paced back and forth with a frantic energy that bordered on hysteria. The guard dogs, sensing the shift, barked sharply, pulling at their leashes, their instincts responding to a threat their handlers could no longer mask. Prisoners who witnessed these moments did so in silence, their hearts pounding with the realization that whatever the guards feared was drawing near. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, a new sound broke across the landscape, deep, thunderous, unmistakable. It was not the distant rumble of artillery that had echoed through the hills for weeks. It was closer, sharper, more resonant. Tanks, vehicles, engines. The prisoners froze. The guards stiffened. And for a moment the entire camp seemed suspended between two worlds. The world of fear that had dominated it for months, and the world of change that had finally arrived at its gates. What followed was a moment unlike any the prisoners could have imagined. A sudden surge of chaos rippled through the guards. Some sprinted toward the camp gates, abandoning their posts. Others discarded their uniforms in frantic attempts to disguise themselves as laborers or civilians. A few shouted commands that no one obeyed. The thin veneer of control, held together for so long by discipline and brutality, shattered completely. The prisoners stood watching this disintegration with hollow disbelief. They had been conditioned to expect stability, even cruel stability, But this unraveling defied everything they understood about the camp's structure. The prisoners did not cheer. They did not rush forward. They did not celebrate. They were too weak, too uncertain, too deeply shaped by the fear that governed every moment of their existence. They had seen guards behave unpredictably before. They had learned that hope could be punished as swiftly as defiance. And so they waited, standing in wary silence, every instinct telling them that danger still lingered, that the moment could still turn deadly without warning. But the sounds outside the camp grew louder, engines growling, metal clattering, voices shouting commands in a language the prisoners had not heard in months. The guards, who had not fled, now vanished behind buildings or into the woods, leaving only the echo of their footsteps behind. The gate that had confined the prisoners for so long hung partially open, swaying gently as though pushed by an unseen hand. The camp, once a sealed world of suffering, lay exposed. Then the soldiers arrived. American troops moved cautiously through the camp's entrance, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the grounds with a mixture of horror and disbelief. These were men hardened by battle, men who had witnessed the devastation of war across Europe, but nothing had prepared them for what they saw in Ohrdruf. The camp's emptiness felt haunted. The barracks stood like hollowed-out shells. The tunnels yawned open like wounds carved into the earth. And the prisoners, thin, pale, hollow-eyed, stood in fragile clusters, watching the soldiers as though seeing phantoms. It was a moment of collision between two worlds, one of unimaginable suffering, the other of liberation born from the violence of war. The Americans approached slowly, careful not to startle the prisoners who stared at them with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and flickering hope. Some soldiers lowered their weapons almost immediately, struck by the frailty of the figures before them. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight. The prisoners, too weak to rush forward, watched with trembling breaths. For many, the concept of rescue felt abstract, unreal. They had long since abandoned the idea that salvation could come from beyond the camp's walls. But liberation had arrived, and with it came a silence so profound that it felt like the camp itself was exhaling after months of holding its breath. In the moments that followed, soldiers moved through the camp with caution and reverence, as though stepping into sacred ground marked by suffering they could not yet understand. They spoke softly to the prisoners, offering water, blankets, reassurance. Some prisoners stared blankly, unable to process the words. Others wept without sound, tears cutting thin lines down their dirt-covered faces. A few reached out weakly, as though afraid their rescuers might vanish if touched. The Americans, confronted with the enormity of what they had discovered, felt something shift inside them. This was not a battlefield. This was not war as they had known it. This was something darker, more calculated, more chilling. The absence of gunfire, the lack of active combat, only heightened the horror. Ohrdruf revealed itself not through violence, but through the residue of systematic suffering, the silence, the emptiness, the frailty of the men who had survived. The camp, which had once thrived on the machinery of cruelty, now stood in stark stillness. Liberation did not erase the darkness within its fences. It merely flooded that darkness with a harsh, revealing light. The prisoners, though technically free, remained suspended in a strange limbo between life and death, survival and collapse. They had been delivered from the regime that had tormented them, yet their bodies and spirits bore the deep imprint of the camp's merciless grip. As the soldiers moved deeper into Ohrdruf, the truth of the camp's brutality became undeniable. Their expressions changed, shifting from confusion to shock, from shock to rage, from rage to a solemn grief that settled across their features like a shadow. They understood in that moment that history had brought them here not only to liberate, but to witness. And the prisoners, still trembling, still uncertain, still hollowed by months of relentless suffering, began to feel something they had not felt in a very long time, the faintest stirrings of safety. It was fragile, overwhelming, and almost too painful to bear. But it was real. For the first time in months, the camp's silence was not oppressive. It was the sound of something ending. And something else, unfathomable, fragile, miraculous, beginning. In the hours that followed the arrival of American troops, the reality of liberation unfolded slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the camp itself resisted letting go of the suffering that had defined it for so long. Soldiers moved through Ohrdruf with sombre purpose, their boots crunching softly over ground that seemed to absorb every sound. They approached each barrack, each yard, each tunnel with a mixture of caution and sorrow, knowing instinctively that every step would reveal something that would deepen their understanding of what had happened here. The prisoners followed their movements with hollow eyes, unsure whether they were witnessing rescue or the beginning of another unknown chapter. The trauma of survival had trained them to distrust relief. They stood in small clusters, whispering fragments of disbelief, some afraid to move too quickly, others too weak to move at all. As American medics began tending to the prisoners, the emotional weight of the moment deepened. The men receiving aid trembled not only from starvation and illness, but from the overwhelming shock of being treated as human beings again. Hands that had only known blows now accepted cups of water. Bodies that had been denied compassion now felt blankets draped gently over their shoulders. For many, the simple act of hearing their own names, spoken softly in a foreign accent, yet with unmistakable kindness, shattered something within them. The prisoners had lived in a world where they were addressed only by numbers, where identity had been stripped away with ruthless efficiency. To be recognized as a person once more was almost unbearable. Some broke into tears not because their suffering was ending, but because the act of being seen reopened emotions they had buried just to survive. The American soldiers, though trained for the horrors of war, found themselves unprepared for the horrors of Ohrdruf. They had witnessed bombings, firefights, and destruction across Europe, yet nothing compared to the eerie stillness of a camp designed around the slow, calculated erosion of human life. The absence of noise, the silence that had always pressed down upon the prisoners, seemed to echo louder now, filling the air with a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. The soldiers exchanged glances with one another, their faces pale, their expressions stunned. Some turned away briefly, needing a moment to gather themselves. Others clenched their jaws tightly, channeling their grief into resolve. What they saw in Ohrdruf etched itself into their consciousness with a permanence no battlefield could ever match. As the day progressed, American officers moved methodically through the camp, documenting everything they found. They took notes, photographs, testimonies. They walked the perimeter, surveyed the barracks, examined the tunnels with a sober, meticulous attention, born not of curiosity, but of duty. They understood that what had occurred here needed to be preserved in the record, not because the prisoners demanded it, but because the world would need to confront the truth. Some soldiers shook their heads in disbelief as they surveyed the grounds, unable to fathom how a place like this had been allowed to exist. Others stood in silence, their sorrow settling deep into their bones. They knew that reporting what they had witnessed was necessary, but they also knew that words and images could never fully capture the suffocating despair that permeated Ohrdruf. For the prisoners, the experience of liberation unfolded unevenly, shaped by their physical condition and the psychological weight they carried. Some collapsed into the arms of the soldiers who approached them, their legs finally giving out after months of forced endurance. Others remained upright but motionless, as though rooted to the earth by fear that this reprieve would be snatched away. A few attempted to express gratitude, but their voices cracked, the words catching in throats that had grown accustomed to silence. They struggled with the sudden shift from terror to safety, from oppression to recognition. It was not simply that they had been freed, it was that they were now expected to feel, to hope, to trust, after months of numbing themselves to survive. For many, liberation was not a moment of celebration, but a fragile, trembling encounter with humanity that felt almost too intense to bear. The guards who had fled left behind an atmosphere of unfinished cruelty. Their abandonment of the camp did not erase the suffering they had inflicted. Instead, it cast a long, chilling shadow over the grounds, a reminder that the brutality had been deliberate, calculated, and, until the final hours, relentless. The Americans, aware that the perpetrators had vanished into the surrounding hills or civilian populations, felt a surge of anger mingled with grief. Some voiced their outrage aloud, their words carrying a sharper edge than they intended. Others simply inhaled slowly, as though steadying themselves against the wave of emotion pressing against their chests. They understood that pursuing justice would be difficult, but they also understood that witnessing the truth of Ohrdruf placed upon them an obligation that extended far beyond the confines of the war. As evening approached, the light faded softly over the camp, casting long shadows across the barracks and walkways. For the prisoners, the dimming sky carried a significance they had long forgotten, the possibility of a night without terror. The guards were gone. The dogs were silent. The shouts that had defined every evening were now replaced by the quiet murmur of soldiers offering reassurance. And yet, sleep did not come easily. The prisoners lay on their bunks, those who were strong enough to return to them, and stared up at the wooden planks above, listening to the strange, unfamiliar sounds of compassion. Their bodies trembled, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming realization that their nightmare might finally be ending. Yet ending a nightmare did not erase its imprint. Some prisoners found themselves overwhelmed by memories that surged back with startling clarity. The mind, finally released from constant survival mode, began to process what it had endured. These moments of reflection were both painful and necessary. For years, the suffering of Ohrdruf would live inside them, shaping their thoughts, their identities, their relationships. Liberation marked the beginning of healing, but healing itself would be a long, uneven path, shadowed by the immense weight of what had happened within these fences. The American soldiers, after moving carefully through every corner of the camp, gathered in somber clusters to absorb the enormity of what they had seen. Conversations were quiet, voices low. No one spoke of victory. No one spoke of triumph. This was not a moment for those sentiments. Instead, they stood together in silent acknowledgement that the war had revealed something far darker than enemy lines or military strategy. Ohrdruf was not just a site of suffering, it was a revelation of the depths to which humanity could descend when cruelty was normalized and compassion extinguished. The weight of this understanding settled heavily on their shoulders. As night settled over the camp, a strange stillness fell across the grounds. The fences, once instruments of containment, now stood without purpose. The watchtowers, once symbols of oppression, now loomed as hollow reminders of a past rapidly dissolving into memory. The prisoners, though overwhelmed, felt a subtle shift within themselves. The smallest spark of ownership over their own breath, their own heartbeat, their own body. Freedom, even in its most fragile form, coursed through them with quiet insistence. It was not loud, it was not triumphant, but it was real. In the days that followed, Ohrdruf would become one of the first camps documented by American forces on German soil. Generals would walk its grounds in stunned silence. Journalists would record the shock etched into soldiers' faces. Photographs would circulate around the world, offering early glimpses into the system of cruelty that had operated in the shadows. But on the night of April 4th, none of that had happened yet. There was only the silence of a liberated camp, the breath of survivors adjusting to a world that felt impossibly large, and the solemn reverence of soldiers who understood that history had placed upon them the task of bearing witness. For the prisoners, liberation did not erase the suffering they had endured. It did not restore the lives they had lost, the families torn from them, the identities stripped away. But it offered something else, something equally profound. It offered the possibility of reclaiming their futures, of rebuilding their shattered sense of self, of stepping beyond the boundaries of a place designed to destroy them. Liberation was not an end. It was a beginning. Ohrdruf's silence, once a suffocating presence, became a space for breath. The fences, once symbols of confinement, became markers of a past left behind. The survivors, though frail and hollowed by months of torment, carried within them a resilience that the camp had failed to extinguish. Their existence, trembling, uncertain, yet undeniable, was a testament to a truth that echoed far beyond the hills of Thuringia. Cruelty may consume, but it does not always conquer. And so the final image of Ohrdruf is not the brutality of its operation, nor the panic of its collapse, nor even the shock of those who discovered it. The final image is quieter, more profound. It is the image of survivors standing beneath the open sky, inhaling air no longer bound by fear, their silhouettes fragile yet unbroken, their presence a quiet defiance against the darkness that tried to claim them. It is the image of life persisting through the bleakest of human conditions. It is the image of endurance. In the end, Ohrdruf stands as a reminder, not only of the cruelty inflicted there, but of the unwavering human will that survived it. A place of relentless suffering became, in its final hours, a place where resilience revealed itself with undeniable clarity. The darkness of Ohrdruf was vast, but the light carried out of it by those who lived to tell their stories would travel far beyond its fences, illuminating truths the world needed to see. This is the legacy of Ohrdruf, a warning carved into history, a testament to endurance, a call to remember. And for the prisoners who walked out of that camp, some carried, some supported, some moving on trembling legs, it was the first step back into a world that finally allowed them to live again. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.